University, and I'd like to thank you all for joining us for NACADA's latest installment of their webinar series, Developing Intercultural Communication Skills for Academic Advising. We have a lot of great content to get to today, so we're going to be keeping our introductions brief. Today we're joined by Kathy McKeever. Kathy is the current chair for the NACADA Global Engagement Commission, and she comes to us today from Northern Arizona University. There, Kathy serves as the coordinator for International Student Academic Advising. We're also joined today by Yvonne Halden. Yvonne joins us today from University of Manitoba, where she serves as a graduate advisor. Yvonne is also the current chair of the NACADA Webinar Advisory Board. And finally, we'll be joined by Louisa Drescher. Louisa joins us today from Iowa State University. She serves as an academic advisor and a multicultural liaison officer there. She is also the author of the upcoming NACADA Pocket Guide, Cultural Competence in Academic Advising, Skills for Working Effectively Across Cultures. So today, our speakers will be guiding us through data on cultural demographic changes, helping us to understand how cultural diversity can help and what it brings to our institutions and our advising relationships, how both those changing demographics and diversity can impact our communications with our advisees, and strategies for developing our own cultural competence moving forward. It's important to keep in mind that all statements made during this webinar are intended as guidelines only. To apply any cultural characteristics to all individuals of a particular group would be unwise and disrespectful to the individual. Understanding the culture is a starting point in the relationship. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and invite our panelist, Yvonne Halden, to talk to us about why we should pay attention to cultural differences. Yvonne?
Hi, Tyann. It's very evident as we walk through campuses that we are becoming more diverse. As this slide clearly states, institutions are becoming complex environments. The diversity has expanded in ethnicity, religion, culture, sexual orientations, as well as academic levels. We are also living in a world that, due to economic global competition, we need to understand the different cultures we live in for today's society. Part of the diversity is driven by a continual increase of students studying outside their country of origin. As you can see by this graph, there has been a continual growth since 1975. You'll also notice that the largest growth has been between 2000 and 2010, where the number of students studying outside of their country of origin has doubled. This is mostly due to the excellent reputations of higher education in the United States, Canada, and many European countries. Our latest data indicates that 4.3 million students are now studying outside their country of origin. And this leads us to ask, where are these students studying? As you can see by this next graph, the top 5 destinations are United States, Canada, Australia, Germany, and France. The United States has the largest percentage, but there are many countries that fall between the 4 to 5% range, and Canada is one of them. The other question is, where are the students coming from? Here is a representation of the countries of origin for the international students in the US. Top 5 being China, India, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, then Canada. And the next slide shows the top 5 countries of origin for the international students in Canada. It's very interesting that the top 4 countries are the same, and it's great to see that the 5th one are our neighbours. The next few slides will show enrollment data from both the United States and Canada. This slide shows the increase in international enrollment in the undergraduate and graduate levels between 2004 and 2011. And according to a November 2012 Open Doors press release, the United States now have 31% more international students studying in the US institutions than a decade ago. The next slide shows an increase in overall international enrollment in Canada between 2005 and 2010. And according to the Association of Universities and Colleges Canada's publication, Trends in Higher Education 2011, since 1995 there has been a 28.5% increase in international enrollment in Canada. This graph shows the education level of international enrollment in Canada in 2000 and 2008. You will see that it was in the undergraduate programs where the increase really took place. More recent data has indicated that Canada has had an 11% increase in international student enrollment between 2011 and 2012. Even though international enrollment is part of the cultural diversity in our institutions, mass immigration may also be a contributing factor to the diversity on our campuses. Currently, there are 10 countries that have the largest immigration population as a percentage of their total population, and I was very surprised to see who the top 2 were. And that is mainly due because of the small native-born population and the huge employment and investment opportunities that are available in these countries. But the next highest are Australia, Canada, and the US. There is no denying both international enrollment and mass immigration has become and will continue to be an important part of the intellectual and cultural and financial contribution to today's campuses. So, since this is the case, our new reality is academic advisors must find a way to support students from different countries more than they have ever done before. Clearly, to do this, we have to increase our own cultural competence to understand and respond to their needs as they transition to a new culture.
Thank you, Yvonne. So, given that Yvonne has established for us that it's clear that advisors need to be finding ways to support students from different cultures, we're now going to turn to Kathy to discuss what cultural diversity can bring to our institutions as well as our advising relationships. Kathy?
Thank you, Yvonne. Thank you, Tyann. Cultural diversity brings a number of opportunities and benefits to a campus community. With a national push for internationalization of campuses as well as the creation of global learning curriculums, the campus community may be noticing an increase in international students, as well as course restructuring that now includes a global engagement component. Some of the greatest benefits of cultural diversity include diversification. Diversification of the campus community not only provides a richer educational experience for all students, staff, and faculty by broadening points of view, but it also builds a community of learning that embraces and recognizes new insights to common topics and beliefs. Exposure is another very important benefit to multiculturalism. Exposure and experience are some of the best ways to challenge what you think you know. Without stepping outside of our comfort zones, be it culturally, professionally, or otherwise, we are limiting our ability to learn and grow not only about different cultural perspectives, but also about ourselves. And finally, intercultural interactions seem to provide the most benefits. Learning to communicate across cultures only strengthens our communication abilities as a whole. Consistent interactions with those from other cultures helps to increase empathy and to look for deeper meaning when assigning meaning to all communications. As advisors, many of our interactions will be in the form of prescribed advising appointments, and this increases our likelihood to further develop these skills as long as one is open to this challenge. Along with opportunities and benefits come a number of challenges and fears, some of which are highlighted in this scenario. For this scenario, we start in a 200-level business course that is split about half Chinese students and half domestic students. The Chinese students are transfer students from Chinese universities, and it is their first day of class in the U.S. And I'll just go over the slide briefly. An instructor reports the Chinese students in his class did not know how to participate in the first day icebreaker. The instructor asked students to stand up, state their name, where they're from, and to tell an embarrassing story. The instructor noted the Chinese students' names were unintelligible and that they all said they were from China, excepting one student who said Beijing. The instructor also said there was another exception, and this was one student who told an embarrassing story, while the others stayed silent. And the instructor's conclusion to this was that the Chinese students cannot speak or understand English, and therefore are not equipped to take his class. But is there more to this story? I would argue yes. So this scenario highlights a number of the challenges that are faced by multicultural institutions, some of which are labeled on this slide, and we'll discuss this in a little more detail as we continue. One of the most pressing issues is that there can be language problems that lead to miscommunication. In this scenario, the students' accents and intonations led to the instructor assuming that the students' names were unintelligible. The students presumably pronounced their names in Chinese, which may be difficult for a non-native Mandarin speaker to understand, but it should be recognized that the students likely know how to pronounce their own names correctly. The instructor also interpreted the student's silence as an indication that the students did not understand the instructions, but the instructor did not consider the cultural influences that may have prompted that silence. Instead, he made assumptions based on a lack of cultural understanding. And another common issue is that people tend to make incorrect assumptions or stereotype people from cultures that are different than their own. Most of the time, the incorrect assumptions or stereotyping is based on a lack of knowledge. For example, in the scenario, the instructor may not have realized that the question itself, "Tell an embarrassing story about yourself," may be the cause of the student's apprehension. Asking the students to tell this story in front of the class could be part of the reason for the student's silence, due to the cultural value of face. And a little bit about face. Face is an integral part of Chinese culture. The concept of face includes a combination of social standing, reputation, and honor. If someone were to lose face, they lose social standing among their peers, and losing face in itself is cause for great embarrassment. By asking students to tell an embarrassing story, the instructor was asking the students to lose face. And international students in their first semester at a U.S. institution typically have not learned the nuances of U.S. culture, and getting over or moving past these cultural values can be a great challenge. When we form and believe assumptions and stereotypes, this can lead to bias. The type of language we use is important. In the scenario, rather than talking about students, the instructor used the term they, a word that has the power to other the ones it is applied to. Othering sets up a dichotomy of an in-group and an out-group. It is another way of saying that the student is not an individual, but part of a homogeneous group that is different from the dominant group and therefore does not belong. The word foreign also has this power of othering. Some of our biases come from a lack of understanding of cultural values that differ from our own. Here is a generalization of common cultural characteristics found in Western and Eastern cultures, and they display a number of conflicting values. It is important to remember that no one culture is superior to another, and there's no right or wrong culture. Cultures are just different. While it is true we tend to expect some students from different cultures to adapt to the U.S. way of life, we can't expect students to change who they are. I mentioned that we often have this expectation that students will conform or adapt to the dominant cultural values, but this is much easier said than done. In the scenario, the professor had an expectation that the Chinese students in his class would behave in the same way as domestic students, and when they did not, the instructor identified this as a problem with the students rather than considering the cultural influences that could be driving the behavior. Is it true that some students may not have understood the question or the activity? Definitely. But it does not mean that all of the students should be subject to an uninformed assumption just because they share the same nationality. This is something important for advisors to consider as well. And I think the best way to gain understanding of this is to imagine yourself in their shoes. If I were to study in China, I would want to be respectful and knowledgeable of my host country's cultural values, but I wouldn't be able to turn off or who I am or completely adapt the Chinese way of life. And even if I were to make this my goal, it would take time, experience, guidance, and knowledge. As advisors, we have the opportunities to meet one-on-one with students, and this gives us a great chance to get to know them as individuals and provide this guidance. This means we're in a prime position to talk to students and assist them in understanding the expectations of the U.S. university with the final goal of promoting student success. While assessing the various stages of development that the student is going through, we can then offer suggestions accordingly.
Okay, thank you so much, Kathy. So, as Kathy gave us some great examples to illustrate, incorrect assumptions based on stereotypes, ignorance, or lack of information can often lead to misunderstandings or misreadings of situations. So now we're going to pivot back to Yvonne to consider what the impact of culture on the advising relationship is. Yvonne?
Yes, Tyann. Culture affects the advisory relationship as we may find that we are completely outside of our comfort zone. This may be due to a lack of knowledge, misunderstanding, or difficulty in interpreting another person's behavior through our own cultural norms. How do we equip ourselves in knowing that the nodding head of the Filipino grad assistant means I understand rather than yes, I heard you? Or how do we interpret that the faculty member who does not speak out in staff meetings is not a go-getter, not assertive, or not interested in the department issues, but is in fact showing respect by keeping her ideas to herself? Starting the educational journey of being culturally competent starts with understanding what is culture. Now, as I began this presentation, how many of you were actually taken aback by my accent, even though I have lived in Canada for 30 years? It did not quite meet your expectations of a Canadian, eh? Did it take you a little while to get used to what I was saying, or are you still finding it difficult to follow? Did you recognize where I originally came from, or are you still curious? Am I Irish? Am I Scottish? I would love to know how many of you have chosen Irish. A common mistake. I am Scottish. Now, your next question, though, is where do you stand in Scottish cultural awareness? Have you heard of or know about our famous musical instrument called the bagpipes? Scottish men and boys wear a traditional outfit called a kilt. Have you tried our famous drink, which is Scotch? Or tasted our famous Scottish shortbread? For more adventurous people, have you even eaten some haggis? I am sure you may have read or heard about the novel Jekyll and Hyde, written by our famous Scot, Robert Louis Stevenson. And every new year you may sing Auld Lang Syne, a poem by Robert Burns. Have you watched an old James Bond movie with our gorgeous Sean Connery as James Bond? If you have some sense of the Scottish culture at this level, you are just scratching the surface. Culture is just like this iceberg, and you can see in this slide the vast majority of the iceberg is below the waterline. Aspects of culture that are above the waterline is what we all perceive with our five senses. This includes language, food, music, clothing, literature, etc. The challenges in cultural competence is not above the waterline. It's what you find below the waterline. You could call the waterline the awareness level boundary. Below this level is thinking and feeling characteristics. Thinking being the cultural norm, our roles, our ideologies, our beliefs, and our philosophy. Further down and a little deeper to penetrate is our feelings, which involve our values, attitudes, desires, to name a few. As advisors, we need to understand the inner significance of the culture and dive below the waterline. We also have to keep in mind that each iceberg is unique. In regards to Scottish cultural awareness below the waterline, you usually find Scots are very friendly people, but very stubborn and determined, which is portrayed through Scotland fighting for Scottish independence since 1297 and still trying to attain Scottish independence. Scots are also very moralistic due to Scottish Presbyterianism. We have all been taught our culture. We share our culture with our community that we live in. Our culture governs the boundaries of these groups or communities. Our culture do change and evolve, and after 30 years in Canada, and when I return to Scotland, it is very clear how the Canadian culture now influences me. And when I am in Scotland, I feel that it has changed over time. mainly due to the differences of economic community and the population mobility. Cultural knowledge above the waterline, though, is extremely useful, as this provides you with a great icebreaker as you get to know your students. But as an advisors explore below the waterline, your cultural competence education will increase your confidence to become the advisor you need to be for the cultural diverse campus of today.
Thanks, Siobhan, and thank you for those great examples. So we're now going to turn to Lisa to expand on what are some cultural differences that may impact the advising relationship. Louisa?
Sure. One of those differences refer to the differences in communication styles. And one important thing that we need to remember is that there are several differences in the ways individuals communicate. And we can avoid misunderstandings by, number one, learning about differences in conversational etiquette, and two, by avoiding projecting our styles onto someone else's. The differences you see on the screen are just some we felt are worth mentioning because of their potential for creating misunderstandings, and we'll go over each one of them separately. Take, for example, pauses and silences. The Japanese have a proverb, "He who knows does not speak, and he who speaks does not know." This is a perfect illustration of how some cultural groups differ as far as the emphasis they place on speaking and silence. For North Americans of European descent, for example, silence can feel very uncomfortable or awkward, as it signals a possible breakdown in the communication process. Because of that, we tend to fill those awkward moments with uncertainty reduction strategies, such as asking our advisees lots and lots of questions. In many cultures, however, silence communicates respect and deference. These groups tend to reduce uncertainty by means of silence, observation, or even asking someone else about a behavior that they observe. So, in an advising situation, we need to keep in mind that silence communicates as much as a spoken word. It is an important aspect of the communication process for certain groups, and we need to become more comfortable with the absence of words. So the silent advisee in our office may very well be trying to understand what we just said, or translating what we just said, or even taking time to formulate a response. While silence and pauses can sometimes indicate that something has gone wrong, it is possible that it's being utilized to achieve better communication. In some cultures, it is inappropriate to say no. So the tendency is then to soften a negative answer or statement. For example, some students may avoid saying no by answering a question with another question. Others may turn us down gently as a way of saving face for all concerned. Yet others may say, "Maybe I can do it, I'll let you know," even though he knows it is impossible. There is also the possibility that yes simply means yes, I understand you, and not necessarily yes, I agree with you. Martin and Nakayama shared this very interesting example. An international student from Tunisia had been in the United States for several months before he realized that when he was asked directions and did not know the location of the place, he should tell the truth instead of devising a response. He explained that he had been taught that it was better to engage in conversation, to give a person some response, than to disappoint that person by revealing that he didn't know. So this type of behavior may be misconstrued, despite the fact that an advisee may be simply employing this method to avoid being seen as rude. So when working across differences, you need to be aware of this tendency of softening the negative by certain groups. And keep in mind that responses such as maybe, perhaps, I'll consider it, actually mean no for some of them. So knowing that, a more effective strategy then is to avoid asking yes or no questions altogether. Instead, give your students some options so they can reject what they do not want without feeling they have offended you or disrupted the harmony of the advisor-advisee relationship. Now, the situation we posted at the beginning of the webinar reflects a difference in communication style. More specifically, a difference between direct and indirect communicators, which I will go over. The answer to that, by the way, is all of the above. So the 7 of you who picked that answer, congratulations. When looking at differences between direct and indirect communicators, you can see that direct communicators tend to disclose their needs and intentions through words. They're less likely to imply, and for them, yes is likely to mean yes. Many individuals in North America adopt this style as the most appropriate in most contexts. Indirect communicators, on the other hand, they tend to camouflage their needs and intentions in the verbal message. They are also more likely to imply than to say what they think. For cultural groups who prefer this style, preserving harmony in the relationship is far more important than being totally honest. So, as advisors, we need to remember that different groups place different priorities in telling the truth, being honest, preserving harmony, and trying to avoid conflict. It's also important to keep in mind that individuals in all cultures, may be more or less direct. The style they choose depends on the context or the situation at present. Now let's consider the following exchange between these two neighbors, Mrs. Kurogi and Mrs. Yamashita. After reading it, you may think Mrs. Kurogi is praising the young man's efforts because every day he practices so hard for hours and hours and hours. However, when you look at Mrs. Yamashita's response, her response comes in the form of an apology. So she apologized to her neighbor for her son's late night practices because clearly he was disturbing the neighbor with his late night practices. So Mrs. Kurogi used indirect hints to get her point across. Mrs. Yamashita immediately understood the message by reading between the lines of her neighbor's comments. A very significant way in which groups differ in the way they communicate relates to their preference for high context or low context communication. For high context communicators, most of the information is either in the physical context or internalized in the person. Very little is in the explicit transmitted part of the message. The listener's primary task is to understand what is being said beyond the verbal message, as illustrated in the interaction between the two Japanese women. Low context communicators do the exact opposite. For them, the majority of the information is transmitted through explicit verbal messages. Straight talk tends to be the norm. The speaker is the one who carries the responsibility to ensure the message is clear and persuasive. Intercultural communication researchers have found that in the United States, the tendency is to avoid relying on nonverbal contextual information. Instead, one should be explicit, to the point, and not leave things ambiguous. So, as advisors working with high context students, we need to practice reading between the lines and decoding the nonverbal subtleties accompanying our advice's verbal messages. The reality is that there is likely a lot more to the message than what is being communicated, and we need to be able to catch that.
All right, thanks, Lisa. So now, knowing that these differences in communication styles and meaning across cultures can create gaps in understanding or misreadings of intent in situations, we're now going to turn to Yvonne to talk about what other kinds of communications do we need to understand. Yvonne?
Well, the answer to that question, Tian, is nonverbal communication. What is not being said also matters, and we will cover a few examples of nonverbal communication and their subtleties in order to start decoding some cultural norms. Some of you may realize that a vast amount of communication is transmitted through nonverbal communication. Rolling our eyes sends a message without a word being spoken in the Western culture. We can understand many things by our facial expressions, gestures, eye contact, as well as the use of personal space. So let's start with the use of personal space. Our personal boundaries have been created by our cultural norms. Some cultures have clear boundaries. For example, the Middle Eastern culture groups, especially men, have an ideal distance of 0 to 18 inches, where some Asian societies prefer 3 feet or more. In North America and Western Europe, you will find that the boundary will range between 18 inches and to 3 feet. Many people may be very uncomfortable if you step too close, and it is very evident when they automatically step back. Neither party is being rude, but their cultural boundaries have clashed. It's very important that you respect these boundaries, as they may feel that you are invading their territory. Now, advisors need to know our own personal boundaries, where they fall, and try to respect our advisees' boundaries. Another aspect of communication is to consider how we behave when we meet someone for the first time. Are you like Louisa from a eye contact culture, who greet people by a hug or a kiss on both cheeks? Or are you from a low contact culture, when you engage by very little touching? Can you imagine what it must feel like if you've been taught to just bow or give a short handshake, and you meet someone like Louisa that lives in a country where you suddenly meet someone from a high contact culture? I am sure their body language would say it all, a completely frozen expression. Culture misunderstandings for high contact cultures may be perceived by being very forward, very assertive, while low contact culture appears to be cold and unfriendly. It's important to keep this in mind. A tip is to avoid touching unless you have established a relationship with your advisee. It is safer to communicate your welcome through your smile and a tone of voice. My next area to cover is the pattern of eye contact. Eye contact varies from culture to culture, and there is normally a preferred level of eye contact. Eye contact is intentional, but this may lead to misrepresentation. Avoiding eye contact shows courteous respect in one culture, but it can be exact opposite in another. Respect is given by keeping very little eye contact. How appropriate is it to stare at someone? How long do you hold your gaze? The preferential eye contact for Hispanic groups would be direct eye contact. The intention would be to express interest and communicate effectively. The misrepresentation may be that they are being aggressive and intrusive. For East Indian or Native American cultures, they prefer minimum eye contact, and the intention is not being intrusive or hostile, and may be misinterpreted as a lack of interest. The last area I want to cover is the use of time, and it's one of the most challenging cultural learned behaviors. The expression, like oil and water, they do not mix, describes monochronic and polychronic cultures. These two major time orientations take some adjustment from the start of an advising relationship. Monochronic orientation is when time is a commodity that cannot be wasted. This means they value deadlines, schedules, and keeping to the task. A monochronic culture does not like people to be late or kept waiting. They find it impolite. The monochronic culture people will not meet with anyone if they feel they are too busy. Whereas in the polychronic orientation time is limited and not quantifiable. They always have enough time and appointments, and schedules can be changed or even can be flexible. Their relationships are more important than maybe the assignment or a meeting, and if they are running late, well, that's okay too. This is a visual graph of some of the cultures, where some of the cultures lie in monochronic and polychronic scale. As advisors, we should recognize that this is a cultural issue and not laziness or disrespect. We may wish to find time to help students understand the importance of deadlines and schedules if they are from a polychronic orientation culture. We may even prepare colleagues to have some patience in regards to this. This is one cultural situation that may take some patience to work through.
Thanks, Siobhan. Knowing these differences exist, recognizing them, and having a willingness to understand are beginning pieces. So we now turn to Louisa to talk about what can advisors do to develop their own cultural competence. Louisa?
Yvonne mentioned the demographic changes that are taking place in both the United States and Canada. Cultural competence, I would say, it's a must-have skill for academic advisors today. Cultural competence can be defined as a three-step process. Number one, you need to be aware of your own cultural values, beliefs, and so forth. You need to know how those differ from someone else's, and you need to have the skills to adjust your behavior to the cultural orientation of others, be it nationality, race, ethnicity, religion, ability, and so forth. You need to do that so you can work effectively with culturally diverse populations and issues. I'll briefly go over each one of these steps. Developing self-awareness. Before focusing on the other, we need to focus on self. As advisors, we need to have a strong understanding of how our personal beliefs, biases, values, stereotypes, prejudices, and privilege in age, physical ability, education level, sexual orientation, language, religious affiliation, nationality, race, and etc. We need to know how these things will affect the way we think, behave, and function. In the pocket guide, you see the picture on the screen, Cultural Competence in Academic Advising, Skills for Working Effectively Across Cultures. You will find several self-reflection questions that will help you get started in your self-exploratory journey. Now, besides self-awareness, knowledge about issues affecting underrepresented populations, their cultural background, as well as the barriers limiting their access and success at the institution is very important. Culturally competent advisors have knowledge and understanding of their own cultural values, that's the self-awareness piece, and how they differ from those of other groups. This knowledge is especially important when we are working with international students so that we can help them understand important cultural differences between their home country and their host country and acquire the skills needed to adjust their behavior to the cultural orientation of their current environment. Again, in the pocket guide I just mentioned, you will find an example of how this works in the advising context. In order to have the skills to work effectively with diverse student populations, you need to increase your comfort level in working with differences. This, however, is something that requires daily and persistent work. Training alone is not enough. You can start by gaining an understanding of how you deal with differences. And a commonly referenced framework for diversity development is the developmental model of intercultural sensitivity, also known as DMIS. The DMIS is organized along a continuum of 6 developmental stages and is used to assess how we respond to cultural differences related to nationality, ethnicity, gender, age, sexual orientation, and any other difference learned or shared by a group of individuals. Placement on the DMIS continuum depends on whether we tend to be difference avoiders or difference seekers. Difference avoiders have an ethnocentric perspective, and as such, they see the world through their own cultural lenses. Difference seekers, on the other hand, they have an ethno-relative perspective. They understand there are different cultural orientations, and they tend to see their own culture in the context of other cultures. It is important to understand that moving from one end of the continuum to the other is a lifelong, gradual process of learning to be aware of, understanding, and acquiring the necessary skills to work effectively across differences. Oftentimes, this journey will be a very uncomfortable one because otherness, by its very nature, makes individuals uncomfortable. However, the more opportunities you have to deal with differences, the more comfortable you will be. The more comfortable you are, the better you will be at working across differences. On this slide, you will see a brief description of each of the stages. We do not have time to go over each one of them. In one of the resources we listed for you, Preparing Advisors to Work More Effectively Across Differences, you can read about each of these stages in greater depth. Now, a common question I am asked is, how do I know how culturally competent I am? How can you know that? There's a very effective assessment that can, number one, show you where you are in the continuum, and also provide you with concrete steps you can take to move from one stage to another. The assessment is the IDI, the Intercultural Development Inventory. IDI is a cross-culturally valid and reliable assessment tool for building cultural competence. After you complete the IDI, a profile is generated showing you where you are. So the nice thing about the IDI is that each individual profile is accompanied with a customized intercultural development plan. And this plan provides a detailed blueprint or action steps for you to further develop your cultural competence. For those of you who are interested in learning more the IDI, feel free to contact me, send me an email, and I'll be very happy, to provide you with additional
So now we're going to turn our
information.
attention to the DIE framework. And the DIE framework is a three-step approach that can be useful when trying to dissect or examine a situation or an interaction that's impacted by cultural differences. To take us through the DIE framework, we're now going to turn to Kathy.
Thanks, Tyann. As Tyann mentioned, the DIE framework is a tool, and it stands for Description, Interpretation, and Evaluation. This tool gives individuals a way to assess a situation more critically by evaluating how personal biases and assumptions can influence our thoughts and behaviors towards other people's actions and behaviors. This is especially useful in intercultural situations as it is easy to form misconceptions about other cultures when our understanding is based only on our personal beliefs. As Louisa mentioned earlier, self-awareness is a very important part of moving forward with intercultural competence. So this is a tool to promote an objective way of thinking about an interaction. The description part of the DIE framework is based on factual information delivered without judgment. The goal is to remain objective and think in concrete rather than abstract terms. We should ask ourselves, what happened in the interaction, experience, or situation? What is the person doing? Description focuses on the behaviors of people and the environment in which their behavior takes place. The most important part of the description is to observe without judgment. The end goal is not necessarily to remove emotions from from reactions, but instead to help us understand how our emotions and levels of cultural competence can influence our understanding of individual situations. So in the scenario I spoke about earlier regarding the Chinese students, the description could be something like, the students did not follow the directions given by the instructor. This is true. If the students did not answer the question about an embarrassing situation, they did not follow the instructions. Now that we have a description, we can move on to the interpretation. Why didn't the students follow the instructions? So interpretation is when we attach meaning to the description. What did we see and what do we think about it? The goal is to focus on the interaction and think about what it may mean to the people involved. So in the earlier scenario, again, why didn't the students follow those instructions? The instructor's interpretation was that the students chose not to follow instructions because they didn't understand them, whereas someone else's interpretation may have been that the students did not follow the instructions because they were concerned about loss of face or because they were embarrassed to speak English in front of the entire class. The instructor interpreted the situation based on his own cultural experience, whereas another person may have based their interpretation on a general knowledge and experience of Chinese cultural values. There's no right or wrong when it comes to the interpretation in the DIE. It's our own individual assertion. Our interpretation then leads to our evaluation of what we saw. It involves personal opinion and explanations for what occurred. This is where you can also think about the cultural and personal perspectives that may influence how you make an evaluation. So again, in the scenario with the Chinese students, the instructor's interpretation is that the students did not follow the instructions because they did not understand, and the instructor's evaluation is that they cannot speak or understand English. In contrast, another interpretation could be that the students were never asked to participate in this type of activity before, so they may have been nervous to be on the spot, and they may have been concerned about loss of face. My evaluation would be that students need more experience speaking in front of groups. So let's look at one other example using the DIE framework. The description, or the non-judgmental assertion of the facts, is that Pablo is late for his advising appointment. The interpretation of the behavior is key to the framework because this can be positive or negative, and this can influence what we think of the student. If Pablo is late and the advisor forms a negative interpretation, such as he is irresponsible or doesn't care, the advisor may already form a negative evaluation of his behavior. If the interpretation is that Pablo is late because he had class on the other side of campus or because he went to the wrong building, the advisor may be have a more empathetic reaction to Pablo. The way the advisor understands Pablo's behavior is that it is what will form the advisor's final evaluation of Pablo's motivations. We naturally view things through our personal lens, and this is just one tool to encourage us to remain objective in unfamiliar situations.
Thanks, Kathy. I'd like to take this time to thank Kathy and all of our presenters for sharing their knowledge and expertise with us today. If you have questions, we encourage you to submit those using the Q&A panel to the right-hand side of the presentation module where the PowerPoint was today. But at this time, in closing, we're going to go ahead and turn to each of our panelists and ask them to share what they think we need to keep in mind when working across cultures. So we'd like to start with Yvonne.
Well, Tyann, I do believe that as advisors we have to find more time or find a way to build our relationships with the culturally diverse students. We need to take and reflect on where, as individuals, we are coming from, and also consider if we were in a similar situation and outside of our culture, what would we be needing from a person such as ourselves? Our students are individuals and they have their own nuances, but as advisors we know our role is to educate and help them through this transition.
Excellent. Thank you, Yvonne. And now if we could go ahead and turn to Kathy, what do you think we need to keep in mind when working across cultures?
I think one thing that is really important to keep in mind is that we need to be conscious of our own stereotypes and biases. Culture is a social construct, and therefore there is no right or wrong. No one is superior to another. Even if we have personal beliefs that contrast with those we are working with, we need to try and suspend those judgments in order to have a more productive advising experience. Education is a great tool to help with this. Read books, talk to people, attend webinars, engage. This is how you can help grow your cultural competencies.
Great. Thanks, Kathy. And then in closing, Louisa, would you share with us what you think we need to keep in mind when working across cultures?
Sure. Here's some things I want you to leave this webinar with. Knowledge of culture-specific behavior is useful, but we have to keep in mind that it will never apply to all individuals or circumstances. We mentioned that at the beginning, and I think it's worth mentioning that here again. So all the cultural differences that we shared here should serve simply as a starting point. You should never assume that all members of the same group adopt the same cultural traits. This is dangerous, and it will very likely lead to stereotyping on your part. I also want you to keep in mind that as daunting as a task as this might seem of developing cultural competence, if we do not notice, learn about, and respond appropriately to the diversity in our institutions, misunderstandings are likely to occur. This in turn will greatly compromise the effectiveness of our relationships with the students we advise. Finally, I want you to keep in mind that cultural competence development is a lifelong gradual process of learning to be aware of, understanding, and acquiring the necessary skills to work effectively across differences. This is not something you do Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and by Thursday you're culturally competent.
Thank you, Lisa. So during that time, we had a lot of great questions come in. So we want to go ahead and start here with those. So to any of our panelists, whoever feels like answering, do any of you have any concrete do or don'ts in terms of office layout or decor?
Well, I have one idea just to get in there. Sometimes it's great to have a world map on your wall and have pins in where all the students are coming from, and then the students, when they walk in, they don't feel as if they're the only they're from a country that maybe there are already people there. So I think that's a great idea to have on your
and
in your
to
office.
Expand on what Yvonne said, I work primarily with Chinese students, and I have a map of China on my wall. And when students come in, oftentimes there's a language barrier. But if I ask them, can you show me where your home is? Can you tell me about your home? They seem to brighten up, and they can talk a little bit more easily about that kind of, about their home life. And that kind of leads to an icebreaker to when we get into our major discussions.
Great. Lisa, if I could direct this question to you, do you have any thoughts on how do we balance understanding of different culture of a student and helping him or her become oriented to the United States?
Well, first of all, you need to understand where that student is coming from. As I mentioned during the webinar, if you read in the pocket guide, there's a very good example of how that process works. Knowing where that student is coming from will help you understand what is going on and help you move that student along so that you can take him or her, to adjust the behavior so
great.
that
we also had a really good point raised in the questions that indicated while all the data presented focused on national origin, it's also important to remember that cultural differences arise from religion, ethnicity, and disability as well. For example, deaf culture presents a whole set of values and practices that merit consideration as well. And I raised that because I know during the construction of the presentation that's something our presenters did talk about different segments of culture and how that's broken down, not just in terms of country, but in terms of region or religion or ethnicity. Did any of you want to speak to that?
Well, like we said, we've been very, strategic about what the differences that we mentioned. It's not, when you look at an individual, there are many pieces of that identity. It's not just the nationality or the language, but there are several layers like, political orientation, sexual orientation, ability, social, economic class. All these aspects have to be considered. So, when you're meeting that individual, remember what Yvonne said, looking, you will see, what you see is just the tip of the iceberg. And there are many aspects of that student that are below the water level. And if you take time, and it's very important that you take time to get to know that student so that you can learn about what is that foundation.
I think
what
we
is
are
below
now
the
out
water
of time.
level.
We
That's
did get
extremely
most of the
important.
questions. We do just want to give you a reminder that cultural competence and academic advising, skills for working effectively across cultures, that pocket guide is available via the NACADA website, so you can log in there and check that out if you want to. It has some great reflection questions and some information that really supplements the presentation that you saw today. There is more information available about the IDI and the resources that we referenced today in the materials that were provided. And of course, you should feel free to contact Louisa directly if you have any questions regarding the IDI specifically. So again, thank you so much to our presenters for joining us today, and thank you to our audience for listening in.